The Great Flood. The clay that shattered religion. For centuries, the flood was treated as a sacred line in the sand. In the Western world, it belonged almost exclusively to the Bible, a single man. Noah, a single God. A single act of judgment meant to cleanse a corrupt world. Churches built doctrine on it. Skeptics mocked it. Believers defended it. Either way, the story stood alone, untouchable, sealed inside Scripture, until a piece of broken clay quietly ended that isolation. In the year 1872, deep beneath the streets of London, a man named George Smith sat surrounded by dust, fragments, and silence inside the British Museum. He was not a polished academic. He had no formal university education. He had taught himself to read one of the most difficult writing systems ever created, cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay thousands of years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. Smith spent his days piecing together shattered tablets, brought from the ruins of Nineveh, once the jewel of the Assyrian Empire. These tablets had belonged to the vast royal library of Ashurbanipal, a king obsessed with knowledge, power, and the written word. When Nineveh fell, its library collapsed into rubble, preserving its texts in clay the way fire preserves pottery. Most people walking the streets above had no idea that under their feet, the ancient world was being slowly reassembled. Then Smith translated a fragment that changed everything. It came from what we now call the Flood Tablet, later identified as part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically its 11th tablet. As Smith read, his hands began to shake. The words were unmistakable. The structure was familiar. The events were too precise to dismiss. There was a flood, a chosen survive, a divine warning, a massive boat, the destruction of the world by water. Smith reportedly leapt from his chair, running around the room in disbelief, tearing at his clothes. This was not scholarly excitement. This was existential shock, because the tablet he was reading was at least 1,000 years older than the earliest written versions of Genesis. The flood did not begin with the Bible. It had a much older voice, a man before the myth. The man at the center of this older story was named Utnapishtim. He was not introduced as a prophet or a holy man. He was a citizen, a husband, a builder. He lived in the city of Shuruppak, a real place that once sat along the Euphrates River. Archaeology confirms it existed. Flood layers have been found there. Utnapishtim did not anger the gods through moral corruption, as later traditions would claim. His crime was simpler and more unsettling. Humanity had grown too numerous. 𝐀𝐍𝐶𝐄𝐍𝐓. 𝐷𝐴. The tablets say the gods could not sleep. The clamor of human civilization had become unbearable. This detail matters because it reveals something deeply human about the gods of early Mesopotamia. They were not distant, perfect beings. They were reactive, irritable, capable of regret. The god Enlil, ruler of storms and authority, decided the solution was total erasure, a flood that would silence humanity forever. No trial, no warning, no redemption arc, just water, the whisper through the wall. But not all the gods agreed. The god Enki, creator and protector of humanity, found himself trapped by divine law. He could not directly warn Utnapishtim without breaking the oath of the gods. So he did something strange, intimate, and almost heartbreaking. He spoke to the walls of Utnapishtim's house. Wall, listen. Read, hut, understand. Imagine that moment. You are home. The world feels normal. And suddenly the very structure around you begins to speak not in thunder, not in fire, but in a quiet, urgent voice. It tells you to tear your life apart with no proof that tomorrow will even come. Destroy your house. Build a boat. Abandon your possessions. Save your life. No promise of reward. No explanation. Just urgency. This is where the story stops being myth and starts feeling uncomfortably real. Utnapishtim had every reason to hesitate, every reason to doubt his sanity. But he didn't. He believed. The shape of survival. The vessel Utnapishtim built was not the sleek ark, later imagined in paintings. The tablets describe something stranger, a massive cube, sealed with bitumen, 7 decks high, engineered for stability rather than beauty. This was not a religious symbol. It was engineering. He hired craftsmen. He gathered animals, seeds, tools. He brought his family aboard, and then he sealed the door. When the flood came, it did not arrive gently. The ancient texts describe the opening of the Abzu, the primordial deep beneath the earth. Rain fell with such violence that the sky turned black. Winds screamed. Cities vanished. What is most striking is what the tablets say next. The gods themselves were terrified. They fled to the highest heavens. They huddled together, hungry, frightened, watching the destruction unfold below them. Some wept, some regretted their decision. The same beings who had ordered annihilation were now powerless to stop it. This is not the story of an all-controlling deity. It is the story of creators who lost control. After the silence, when the waters finally receded, Utnapishtim released birds to test the land. First a dove, then a swallow, then a raven that did not return. When the boat rested on a mountain, he emerged into a world stripped bare. He offered a sacrifice. The gods gathered around the scent like flies. The tablets say, a line so raw, it almost feels embarrassing in its honesty. Enlil was furious that a human had survived. Enki defended his actions. In the end, Utnapishtim was granted immortality, not as a reward, but as a way to remove him from the human world forever. A survivor who no longer belonged among the living. Why this changes everything. When George Smith read this tablet, the implications were unavoidable. This was not coincidence. This was inheritance. The biblical flood did not appear in a vacuum. It emerged from a much older cultural memory, reshaped, moralized, and narrowed over time. The story traveled through oral tradition, through exile, through translation, through power. Clay came before parchment. Memory came before doctrine. This does not make the Bible false, but it does make it human. And that realization unsettles people far more than disbelief ever could. Because if one sacred story has a prehistory, how many others do? And as the waters rose in Mesopotamia, evidence suggests they were rising elsewhere too. Different lands, different names, the same fear. That is where this story truly begins to deepen. When the world remembered together, there is a quiet shift that happens after the first revelation. In chapter 1, the shock was intellectual. Clay tablets, 𝐷𝐷𝐴𝐻𝐿, a flood story that existed long before Scripture. That discovery alone unsettles belief systems, especially those built on the idea of uniqueness. But chapter 2 is where the unease deepens, because once you accept that, Mesopotamia remembered a flood before the Bible. The next question does not come from religion at all. It comes from reason. Was this memory isolated, or was it shared? If it was isolated, then the story of Utnapishtim is simply a regional myth that later writers borrowed from, a coincidence of influence, an accident of storytelling. But if it was shared, if the same memory appears in places that never touched Mesopotamia, then we are no longer talking about myth. We are talking about a global human experience. And that is where denial begins to collapse. Why ancient people told flood stories? Modern readers often misunderstand ancient stories because we assume they were created for entertainment or belief. They were not. Ancient stories existed for one reason above all others: survival. Before writing, before borders, before science, the only way to preserve knowledge was through memory. And memory needed emotion to survive: fear, awe, reverence, loss. This is why flood stories do not feel symbolic when you read them carefully. They feel urgent, personal, raw. They talk about people screaming as water rises, animals crying, darkness swallowing the sky, families separated forever. These are not theological inventions. They are emotional recollections. You don't invent that level of detail unless it burned itself into you. Mesopotamia revisited memory, not metaphor. The flood tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh is not alone. The Atrahasis epic, written centuries earlier, describes nearly the same catastrophe. In that version, humanity multiplies rapidly. Cities expand. Noise fills the land. The gods cannot rest. They attempt to reduce human population through disease and famine. But when that fails, they choose water. The flood is not moral. It is practical. This detail matters because it strips the story of later religious framing. Early flood stories are not about sin. They are about scale. Humanity became too large, too disruptive, too powerful. That fear did not disappear with time. It was inherited. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts on the video. India, the flood as cosmic reset. Far from Mesopotamia, on a completely different cultural timeline. Ancient India preserved its own version of the flood. In the Satapatha Brahmana, one of the oldest Vedic texts, a man named Manu encounters a small fish asking for protection. Manu shelters it. The fish grows impossibly large and reveals divine knowledge. A flood is coming. Everything will be destroyed. Only preparation will save life. Manu builds a boat. He gathers seeds of every living thing. When the waters rise, the fish guides the vessel to safety. After the flood, Manu repopulates the world. Notice what is absent here. There is no borrowing from Mesopotamia. No shared gods. No shared language. Yet the structure remains. A warning. A chosen survivor. A vessel. Seeds. A reborn humanity. This is not coincidence. This is pattern. China, the memory of endless water. China remembers the flood differently. Instead of a single apocalyptic event, Chinese tradition speaks of a flood that would not end. A disaster that lingered for generations. Swallowing land, destroying villages, and turning survival into a long struggle rather than a sudden escape. The legend of Yu, the great, tells of a man who does not flee the waters, but confronts them. Yu dedicates his life to controlling rivers, carving channels through the land to redirect water away from settlements. He passes his home 3 times without entering it. He neglects family. He sacrifices comfort. Why would a culture remember a flood this way? Because not all catastrophes are sudden. Some drown civilizations slowly. Geological evidence now supports massive, prehistoric flooding along the Yellow River Basin. The story survived not as data, but as identity. China remembered endurance. Africa, floods without stone, preserved in voice. Africa's flood memories are often dismissed because they were preserved orally rather than written in stone. This dismissal says more about modern bias than ancient truth. Among the Yoruba, the world is described as once being submerged, with land emerging again through divine intervention. East African traditions among the Kikuyu, Maasai, and others speak of humanity nearly wiped out by water, with only a few survivors left to rebuild. These stories are not decorative. They are solemn. They are told with respect because they describe a time when the world almost failed. Oral traditions do not survive unless they matter. De Americas. But first, subscribe to the channel. Memory without contact. Here is where skepticism truly begins to struggle. Indigenous cultures of the Americas developed in isolation for thousands of years. No contact with Mesopotamia. No shared scriptures. No shared languages. And yet flood stories dominate their cosmologies. The Hopi speak of previous worlds destroyed by water. The Maya recorded great floods ending earlier ages. The Inca tell of Viracocha flooding the earth before remaking humanity. The Aztecs believed humanity had already been destroyed multiple times. One age ending in water. These are not borrowed stories. They could not be. They are memories carried across generations until writing finally arrived. Why these stories refuse to disappear? Flood myths persist because they encode a truth too large to forget. At the end of the last ice age, vast ice sheets melted rapidly. Sea levels rose over 120 meters. Coastlines vanished. Entire landmasses were swallowed. To modern science, this is data. To ancient people, it was the end of the world. Imagine living on a coast that disappears within generations. Imagine watching familiar land sink beneath the sea. Imagine having no explanation. You would remember. And you would make sure your children remembered too. Religion did not create the flood. It preserved it. This is the quiet conclusion most people resist. Religion did not invent the flood story to scare people into obedience. Religion inherited a memory that was already sacred. Over time, culture shaped that memory to fit their worldview. Mesopotamia emphasized divine regret. India emphasized rebirth. China emphasized resilience. The Bible emphasized moral judgment. Different lenses. Same catastrophe. What we are reading is not competing myths. It is humanity remembering the same trauma from different directions. Why this matters now? We live in an age that believes memory lives in data. Ancient people knew better. They understood that memory lives in stories. Because stories survive when buildings fall. And now, once again, seas are rising. Ice is melting. Coasts are threatened. The ancient flood stories are not supernatural warnings. They are historical ones. Before you continue, if this chapter made you pause, don't move on quietly. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share this with someone who thinks ancient stories are just imagination. Leave a comment and tell me which flood story you grew up hearing. Because in the next chapter, we leave stories behind and go looking for physical proof beneath oceans, deserts, and forgotten ruins. And once you see that evidence, it becomes very hard to pretend this was all just myth. We are not uncovering legends. We are recovering memory